My name is Inuktitut. I'm from Inuktuuqta, but I currently live down south. So I decided to start this channel because I know that there's so many young people and people in general who want to learn Inuktitut, but they're not really sure where to start. Me too, I've been there. I'm still learning Inuktitut, and there's so many different levels, people who are just starting from square one, people who were, kind of in my situation where, tukihi runnaktu, they can understand, but, when it comes to speaking, you get kind of stuck. So I taught beginners Inuktitut for a couple years. I learned French, so I know what it's like to, start from square one. So I'm hoping this channel could be somewhere where, you learn a little bit about Inuktitut. It can sometimes seem like this big thing in your head that's, impossible to achieve when you don't know where to start. So breaking it down, making it more accessible, and, hopefully bringing back Inuktitut, making it something you could use in your day-to-day life, and, hopefully including interviews and topics that are interesting, modern, showing that Inuktitut is something that, is still relevant and should be used today. So yeah, there's so many different dialects, and a lot of times people, you want to learn your dialect if you have one, if you're Inuk. And for me, I've definitely been in that situation. And it's often hard to find like Kivalliq dialect things. But what I've learned is, once you learn the foundation of Inuktitut and how sentences are built, it's easy to adjust it to your own dialect once you have the foundation of like how to learn on your own. So this is where this is coming from, and I hope you enjoy. Ulakut augat na ngayunga kangeklinang mi peroksi mayunga kisiane kaluna nunangani lektunga unatak khayaksa piyaktara atauka isumakat taksi mayunga inukala inuktu ilinyak may kisiane kawimangitu kano piyarunang mata. So uvangat daw teman na isumalaw si mayunga amma inuktu ilinyak tunga suli kawin toko so Inuktitut ilinyak chichilaw tunga nunavut siwunuk savumi amma uiwi vitut ilinyak si mayara daimamman una piyak tichiara. So when I'm teaching Inuktitut, I don't like to just, teach you a word to memorize. So one thing I learned when I was learning French is that, I want to learn how to put things together myself. So why am I saying this? What are the different pieces that give these words meaning, instead of just memorizing something that, I know the meaning to, but I don't know how we get there. So we're going to start off just by talking about how Inuktitut is different from English. So in English, as you can see, words are separate from each other. In Inuktitut, one word can be a whole sentence. So putting things together is kind of more like putting together puzzle pieces. And this scares people off, I think, from learning Inuktitut sometimes, because it can be so intimidating. But it follows a pattern like most languages. So, after a little while, you'll start to pick up these pieces and remember the pattern. So as time goes on, it makes it a lot easier. So just an example, in English, you would say, I am hungry. And in Inuktitut, it would just be one word, gak dunga. So that ending, dunga, says I am. So talking about ourselves is at the end, and gak means to be hungry. So instead of a couple different words put together for a sentence, it's one word, gak dunga. And kind of going back to that, one other big difference is that in Inuktitut, sentences are often backwards. So in English, you say, I am walking. The person you're talking about is at the front. You know right off the bat who you're talking about, and the action is at the end. In Inuktitut, it's kind of flipped. So we say pisuk tunga. So the action pisuk is to walk, and tunga, I am, is at the end. So you can always tell who we're talking about just by looking at the ending. So you see pisuk tunga is the same as the one before that, kak tunga. So that tunga is that I am. So the first part we look at when we're learning Inuktitut is root words. So these are kind of like that first puzzle piece. So usually they're actions. They can be places, things, or feelings. Some examples are sinik, which means to sleep. So sinik. The next one, French people are going to be really good at this one because they, have the R pronunciation. Nere, which is to eat. So nere. Then you have that one, pisuk, which is to walk. Pisuk. And taka, which means to be tired. So these are some basic root words. It's kind of that action. It could be that feeling, which we'll get into later, and it could be, a thing if that's what you're talking about. And endings. So when we're looking at learning Inuktitut, these are kind of like those two main pieces. So this is the very basic. And once you get this down, then you can start adding things to make your sentences a little bit more complicated. So these endings, they tell us who we're talking about. It's like saying I, she, him, or they. And one kind of thing that makes Inuktitut a little bit easier is there's no gender. So when you're talking about a third person, it's always going to be the same ending. And it could also be used to talk about objects. So there's different types of endings. Singular, so when you're talking about one person. Dual, when you're talking about two people. Plural endings, so when you're talking about a group. And then double verb endings, which are more complicated, which talks about, a person or a thing doing something to somebody else or to something. And then you have affixes in the middle. So these make things a little bit more complicated, but not impossible. So these go between the root words and the endings, and they add more detail. So when something happened, to want something, where, so if you're going somewhere, coming back from somewhere, those things would go in the middle. So looking at that basic sentence, you would say pisuk, which is that action to walk, and tunga. So pisuk tunga, I walked. And then for saying I want to walk, this is just an example. We'd add guma, or if you're from Kivalak, guak. So you would say pisu guma yunga, or pisu guak tunga, if you're from the Kivalak. And you might notice that there's a J here instead of a T. And so a trick, which we'll get into, and don't worry if you're not getting it right now, it comes with time. So if it ends in a consonant, so like a K or a Q or a T, you're going to use a tunga. And if it ends in a vowel, so in Inuktitut that would be I, U, or A, you're going to use a yunga. And Inuktitut always kind of flows. So if you're not sure, you could say it both ways, and usually the one that flows better out of your mouth is right. So instead of saying pisu guak yunga, and then you say pisu guak tunga, the tunga kind of flows better. But just showing, how we can change a whole sentence by adding something in the middle. So the basic formula for learning Inuktitut is usually, if it's very basic, you got the root word, which is that action, and then the ending, which is telling you who or what we're talking about. And then once you kind of level up and things get a little bit more complicated, you're going to have that affix in the middle. So we went into the, structure of Inuktitut, those different puzzle pieces, but let's do some practice with the very basics. So we're going to get into some root words and some endings. And the first one we're going to focus on is the I am ending, which, depending on what you use, could be yunga if it ends in a vowel, or tunga if it ends in a consonant, so like a Q, a K, or a T. So we'll also get into some root words. So the first one will be to eat. So into an example, if I'm eating bacon, the word is nere. So this is how it's spelled out, nere. So it's kind of that French R if you speak French. So nere, that's to eat, and nere ends in a vowel. So we're going to use the ending yunga, nere yunga. So I am eating. Another good one is if you're drinking something, the word is imek. So imek. And imek ends in a Q, so we use the ending tunga. Imek tunga. I am drinking. So another good one is if I could sing. I'm not very good. We'd use ingek. Ingek. So ingek ends in a Q, so it's going to be ingek tunga. And right now, okallak tunga. Okallak tunga. I am speaking. So to speak is okallak. And okallak ends in a Q. So we say okallak tunga. I am speaking. Another good one is dusa. Dusa. And dusa ends in a A, which is a vowel. So we are going to say dusa yunga. Dusa yunga, which is I am listening. So you see, you could take a root word and you could even go through any Inuktitut dictionary. You could use different glossaries online and practice adding those endings. So find a random word. Maybe it is iglak. Iglak, which is to laugh. So iglak ends in a Q. So we would say iglak tunga. I am laughing. And so this is kind of the foundation of Inuktitut. Once you memorize those endings, you can build your vocabulary and learn those new root words as you go. So we went over I am. The next one is you. So how do I say something like you are walking? So it's going back to those endings. We're going to keep that same root word, bisuk. Bisuk, which is to walk. And the ending for you are is tutit. Tutit. So because bisuk ends in a K, we say bisuk tutit. It's going to follow that same pattern as, that tunga or yunga. So if you could take a guess, if we use a root word like iga, which is to cook, iga, we're going to say iga yutit. So that means you are cooking. So if we say I'm cooking, iga yunga. If you're cooking, I would say iga yutit. So another example is if we go back to nere, which is to eat, nere. I want to say you're eating, I would say nere yutit. Nere yutit. Because you are eating, and nere ends in a vowel. So we're using that yutit. So if we choose something that ends in a consonant, like maybe realak, that's a bigger one, realak, which is to yell, I would say yalak tutit. You're yelling. And we're just going to keep following that pattern. So another example, maybe we say imek, you're drinking something. I would say imek tutit. Imek tutit. And then the last one, which is kind of like, I would call it like the big three. So we'll get into dual endings later. We'll get into talking to groups later on. But, you know, when you're just getting started, the big three is me, you, and a third person. So it could be him, her, them, like one single third person, or it could be it could be an object. So all of those use the same ending. So for example, for bisuk, going back to walking, to say he or she is walking, you would say bisuk dok. Bisuk dok. He or she is walking. And there's no gender, so it's always going to be the same. Doesn't matter what gender they are, which is nice. There's less things to remember. So for nere, going back to eat, you would say nere yok. Nere yok. So because nere ends in a vowel, we're going to use yok. So he or she is eating, nere yok. And for imek tok. He or she is drinking, imek tok. Or if you want to say kea, which is an action, kea, which is to cry, kea ends in a vowel. So you're going to say kea yok. Kea yok. He or she is crying. So when we talk about objects, that's a good example too, because it's going to be the same ending as he or she. For example, if something's broken, you could say sekomik. Sekomik, that means it's broken or shattered. You would say sekomik tok. Sekomik tok. It's broken. Or if what's another good object action? It's hot. So maybe somebody's gonna touch a pan, you want to warn them it's hot. Unak means it's hot. So you would say unaktok. It's hot. Unaktok. So we're using that same ending we used to talk about, you know, a third person, but we're talking about an object. So those are the basic, you know, big three endings. We'll get into questions at another time, but for now, these are, you know, the main ones to practice memorizing and, you know, knowing the difference between when to use that J for the ending or T. So just a little practice. I'm going to say a few things in Inuktitut and just practice, you know, trying to figure out, you know, who am I talking about? And I'll just use the same root words just to, you know, reinforce and to use things that, you know, you've already learned. So, Inuktuuqta. Inuktuuqta. So you could pause it. I'll put in the answer next, but just practice. Inuktuuqta. Nereyok. Nereyok. Sekomik Inuktitut, Seqomiktut, Nereyutit, Nereyutit, Nereyunga, Nereyunga, Siniktutit, Siniktutit, Iglaktunga, Iglaktunga, Iglaktuk, Iglaktuk. So yeah, I hope that was helpful, and we'll get into more things as we go. So, you know, as we're building up our language capabilities. But yeah, Thank you.